the thing is, I think I was on such a high anyway, and so was Catherine, about George, that really we were happy to show him off to whoever wanted to see him. As any new parent knows, you're only too happy to show off your new child and, you know, proclaim that he's the best looking or the best everything.
It began not with trumpets or a golden crown, but with a quiet image. A 9-year-old boy walking behind a king, his small hands steady on the trailing edge of royal velvet. Amid the grandeur of King Charles III's coronation, where choirs soared and ancient rituals echoed through Westminster Abbey, there was a quieter message. One that slipped past the spectacle and spoke straight to the core of monarchy. Prince George wasn't there as an accessory to history. He wasn't perched safely at the margins or shielded from view. He moved within the ceremony, not apart from it, but of it. For centuries, the role of page of honor has been assigned to teenage sons of noble houses, chosen for bloodline and discretion, trained to follow silently and carry the robes of royalty. It's a tradition rooted in formality, not emotion. But George was no ordinary page. He wasn't the child of a duke or viscount. He was the crown's next chapter. And placing him in this role wasn't just symbolic, it was intentional. King Charles, ever a student of image and timing, knew exactly what he was doing. As the nation welcomed a new monarch, Charles positioned the future just behind him. Not as a shadow, but as a promise. George didn't wave. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. His presence alone spoke louder than words. The line of succession was no longer theoretical. It was walking the aisle. This was no gentle family cameo. It was a precise move, one that historians will revisit not for its pageantry, but for its message. Because that day, behind the spectacle of crowning, a second story unfolded. Quiet, but undeniable. The heir walked behind the king, and with each step, the monarchy inched forward. Not just in ceremony, but through the quiet decisions made long before the Abbey doors opened. Long before the cameras flashed and the organ thundered through Westminster Abbey, a quieter conversation had been unfolding. Behind the door of Kensington Palace, around familiar dinner tables and glances exchanged between two parents who knew exactly what the crown demands. For Prince William and Princess Catherine, the invitation for George to serve as a page of honor wasn't about logistics. It was a deeper question of timing, of readiness, and of how much a 9-year-old should be asked to carry. No one understood the weight of tradition more intimately than they did. William had lived it, walked behind his mother's coffin at 15, grieved beneath the eyes of a watching world, and spent years molding his own path under relentless scrutiny. Catherine, though newer to the royal orbit, had weathered its storms with grace, mastering not just the language of diplomacy, but the silence between gestures. So when the call came, asking whether their eldest son would walk beside the king, the answer wasn't automatic. It was measured. A pause filled not with resistance, but with reflection. Because saying yes meant lifting the curtain on George's childhood, if only for a moment. It meant allowing the public a frame-by-frame memory that would last far beyond the day itself. And then, something shifted. Not in the institution, not in the media, but in George himself. That spring, aides began to notice a spark. He asked about the crown jewels, about the scepters and robes. He watched grainy footage of past coronations with the kind of quiet intensity that hinted at something deeper. It wasn't curiosity for spectacle. It was interest with purpose. "He's asking real questions," one aide reportedly said. "He's not being pushed. He wants to understand." For William and Catherine, that changed everything. Because this wasn't about preparing a child to be seen. It was about recognizing a child who was already looking ahead. Their decision wasn't driven by pressure, tradition, or even public expectation. It was rooted in instinct, the kind only parents possess. And so, with quiet certainty, they said yes, not to a performance, but to a moment that would show without a word that this child knows who he is and is beginning to understand who he may one day need to become. But allowing him to walk that path so soon meant adjusting more than a family decision. It meant adjusting tradition itself. Within the architecture of royal tradition, every role is carved with centuries of precision, and every player is chosen accordingly. Pages of honor, though rarely noticed by the public, are usually teenage boys from aristocratic bloodlines, handpicked for discretion, stature, in their distance from the throne. Prince George checked none of those boxes. He wasn't from a noble household. He didn't stand at the edge of royal responsibility. He stood at its center, the heir to the crown itself. Tradition had always drawn a quiet boundary around such children. The heirs watched. They didn't serve. Their participation was reserved for another lifetime, one that would begin with a coronation of their own. But King Charles changed the rhythm. By placing his grandson among the pages, he didn't just expand the cast of characters. He rewrote the scene entirely. There was no press briefing, no formal declaration that protocol was being set aside. But for those fluent in royal language, the shift was unmistakable. This wasn't ceremonial redecoration. It was institutional reframing. George's inclusion signaled a narrowing of the gap between observation and participation, a deliberate softening of the line between childhood and inheritance. His presence wasn't a nod to the past. It was an offering to the future. And in making that choice, the monarchy did what it rarely allows itself to do. It adapted, in plain sight. George didn't break tradition. He walked straight through it, under the gaze of history, with full permission. And in doing so, he transformed an age-old ritual into something more alive, more immediate, and more revealing. That transformation became visible in the smallest of gestures, during the most sacred of moments. At first glance, it was just fabric, rich velvet and gold embroidery, trailing behind King Charles III as he walked the aisle of Westminster Abbey. But when Prince George reached out, his fingers closing gently around its edge, the robe became something more. It was no longer just part of a costume. It became an extension of the crown's weight, passed for a moment into smaller hands. In the language of monarchy, where gestures speak louder than speeches, this one spoke volumes. George wasn't simply following his grandfather. He was steadying the garment that symbolized 1,000 years of rule. And in doing so, he entered into a choreography as old as the Abbey's stones. There were no whispered instructions, no dramatic cues, just instinct and presence. He walked not in front and not far behind, Mom, but in quiet tandem. Close enough to assist, distant enough to respect. A positioning that echoed something deeper than etiquette. It echoed inheritance in motion. There were no cameras trained on his expression, no headlines screaming his name, but the meaning was clear to those who knew what to look for. George wasn't rehearsing tradition. He was reinforcing it, step by step, hand by hand. That robe, heavy with history, had once cloaked kings and queens through wars, alliances, and abdications. Its threads held more than luxury. They held memory. And in gripping it, George wasn't just helping the king. He was becoming part of the story himself, not by declaration, but by instinct. Not with grandeur, but with stillness. He wasn't yet crowned, but for those watching closely, it was already clear. The steps he took inside the Abbey were just the beginning. What followed, away from the cameras, would reveal how deeply that moment had marked him. By Monday morning, the velvet was gone. The Abbey stood silent. The golden carriage had disappeared from view. And Prince George, freshly pressed uniform and backpack in tow, returned to school, just as he always had. There were no salutes at the school gates, no royal entourage, no whispers of state, but the stillness carried weight, because everyone knew. Just 2 days earlier, that same boy had walked through Westminster Abbey under the eyes of the world. He had held a piece of royal legacy in his hands. He had stepped through history in real time. Now he was back in the classroom, pencil case in hand, raising his hand like any other 9-year-old. That contrast wasn't accidental. It was the point. William and Catherine had long been deliberate about their children's rhythm. One foot in the institution, the other planted firmly in real life. They understood what too much attention, too soon could do. They'd both lived its consequences. So while the coronation was a defining moment for George, it wasn't allowed to become a defining identity. No special treatment, no exemptions from classwork or playground routine. Just quiet grounding. Because true royalty, in their eyes, wasn't about being elevated. It was about being prepared. And that preparation didn't end inside the Abbey. It continued subtly through math homework, reading assignments, and group projects no one else would remember, but that George would carry with him nonetheless. What he experienced that weekend had changed him, but the world around him, and the expectations within his home remained unchanged. And that was the lesson. A king in waiting doesn't grow by ceremony alone. He grows in ordinary hours, shaped not only by history, but by how gently his family lets him return from it. Privately, those closest to the family said it plainly. William and Catherine were proud, not just of how their son had walked or stood or bowed, but of the way he had absorbed it all. The solemnity, the silence, the gravity. Not overwhelmed, not distracted, just present. To outsiders, George's participation may have looked like a symbolic gesture, but to his parents, it was something more personal, more revealing. He wasn't playing a role, one palace insider shared. He understood it. Not completely, of course. He's still a child, but enough to feel its weight. And that weight, that invisible sense of what it means to be watched, remembered, expected, was something William and Catherine never wanted to impose too early. They've lived what pressure can do when it arrives uninvited, when legacy turns into burden before the person beneath it is ready. That's why every step George took that weekend was carefully measured, not to control him, but to protect him, to guide him through the reality of reality without letting it replace the simplicity of childhood. Because the real test wasn't whether he could walk the aisle, it was whether he could walk back into everyday life with the same ease. And he did. By Monday, George was once again a schoolboy, but now one with a memory stitched into his story, one that wouldn't be spoken about often, but would live quietly inside him, shaping how he carried himself going forward. His parents didn't need the world to see that. They only needed him to feel it. Because if the monarchy is to endure, it won't be because of who wears the crown, but because of how the next in line learns to carry the space beneath it. Before he stepped into the Abbey, before a single camera lens found his face, Prince George had already been dressed in legacy, not in jewels, not in personal emblems, but in fabric carefully chosen to carry quiet meaning. Scarlet, white, gold trim, a lace cravat. To the public, it may have looked like ceremonial attire, quaint, traditional, even charming. But to those within the palace, every stitch served a purpose. His deep red coat, lined with gold braid, was modeled after the court uniforms worn by pages of honor for centuries, a deliberate echo of history, not royalty. There were no monograms, no princely crests, nothing to signal individual status, because that was the point. George wasn't dressed as a prince, he was dressed as a servant of duty, just like every other boy who had held a royal train before him. But unlike those boys, he stood much closer to the throne, and in that proximity, every detail mattered. Underneath the coat, a satin waistcoat gleamed in the Abbey light. His breeches matched, secured with ivory stockings and black buckle shoes, replicas of the very pairs worn by pages in the reign of George VI. To the uninformed eye, it may have read as costume, but in truth it was choreography. Monarchy expressed through textile, because in the royal realm, clothing is never simply worn, it is spoken. The message? George was not playing dress-up. He was being placed, framed deliberately within an ancient system, not elevated above it, not yet, but introduced to it on its terms. And he wore it not with stiffness, but with poise. Observers noted how the white gloves framed his small hands as he steadied the train, how the lace cuffs fluttered slightly with each step. But what stood out most wasn't the detail, it was the stillness. He didn't fidget, he didn't flinch. He carried the outfit the way he carried the moment, with quiet understanding. Because this wasn't pageantry for the public, it was a private reminder to George himself. This is what it looks like to serve before you lead. To the outside world, it may have looked like a touching family gesture, a proud grandfather inviting his grandson into a sacred moment of legacy. And in a way, it was. But inside the palace, those who understood the rhythms of monarchy knew better. This wasn't spontaneity. It wasn't warmth dressed up in regalia. It was a statement, calibrated, composed, and years in the making. King Charles III has spent a lifetime waiting for this role. He's studied public perception with precision, navigated the shifting winds of modern opinion, and witnessed firsthand what happens when the monarchy drifts too far from the people or reveals itself too soon. So when Coronation Day finally arrived, Charles didn't just mark the beginning of his reign. He offered a vision for its future. and he did so in silence. There were no interviews, no articles announcing George's involvement. The moment was allowed to unfold without narration, because Charles understands that in the royal theater, the most powerful images are the ones left unexplained. By placing George directly behind him, the king wasn't simply honoring bloodline. He was visualizing succession, turning it into something that could be seen, absorbed, and quietly accepted. In a time when monarchies across the world are shrinking or fading into ceremonial relics, Britain's royal family made a different choice: to reveal its next chapter, not through words, but through presence. Not all at once, not in a rush, but with clarity. And George, standing there in scarlet and white, wasn't a child swept up in pageantry. He was part of a narrative being stitched, carefully, deliberately, into the public imagination. There was no fanfare, no headlines shouted his name the next day, but the image had already imprinted itself. A 9-year-old boy dressed in history silhouette, walking just behind the sovereign, not clutching his father's hand, not waving to crowds, but steady in his place, eyes forward. The moment lingered longer than anyone expected. In social media threads, newspaper columns, and quiet living rooms across the country, the conversation began to shift. It wasn't about how regal Charles looked or how seamless the coronation appeared. It was about who stood close enough to matter and what that closeness meant. George hadn't spoken a word. He hadn't performed or posed, but somehow his presence told the audience everything they needed to know. The future isn't waiting, it's walking. For a monarchy often criticized for being slow, distant, or out of touch, this was a rare and subtle pivot, not in messaging, but in framing. The royal family didn't deliver a speech on continuity. They showed it. And for those watching, from loyalists to skeptics, the picture was hard to ignore. The crown wasn't just crowning a king, it was introducing the rhythm of a new era, already beating softly behind him. There was no explicit invitation to trust the next generation, but there didn't need to be. George's proximity did the talking, and once the image was out, it couldn't be undone. There was a time when royalty existed only in bedtime stories for Prince George. Castles, crowns, kingdoms wrapped in fairy tales and safely tucked between the pages. But on May 6th, that fairy tale stepped into reality. He walked beneath vaulted ceilings that had witnessed the crowning of emperors. He stood within rituals older than memory, and for a few quiet moments, he carried history, not as fantasy, but as fabric. Since then, the robes have been folded away. The choir songs have faded, the photographs have been archived, and yet something remains. The image of a Pomsky, composed but unadorned, walking behind the king, still lingers, not because of what he said, but because of what he showed. He revealed that legacy isn't inherited all at once. It arrives in fragments, in moments, in the silence of knowing where to stand, in the calm of holding a burden without flinching, in the ability to return to a desk on Monday morning, still carrying a piece of Saturday's crown in your posture. The monarchy didn't pass a torch that day. It didn't need to, because through George's hands, his footsteps, and his stillness, the message was already moving forward. Quiet, measured, undeniable. And that may be the crown's greatest strength, not its ability to command attention, but its gift for letting transition unfold so gently that by the time the world realizes it's happened, it already has.